Well, I'm with Shari Tishman. She is a lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Education and a senior research associate at Harvard Project Zero, where she formerly served as director. Her research focuses on the development and teaching of thinking, the role of close observation in learning, and learning into the arts. The author of numerous books and articles, Shari Tishman's most recent book is Slow Looking, The Art and Practice of Learning Through Observation. And thank you very much for talking with us about this research. It's a great pleasure to me. And I'd like to ask you, what is the concept of slow looking and how does the art and practice of learning through observation help us to look beyond the surface of this complex world we live in?
Thank you. It's a great question, and I'll dive in a minute. But first, let me thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas with you. It's great to be talking with you again, Renata, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to share some ideas with your educator colleagues in Brazil. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So you ask a great question, and it's a big question. So I'll share some ideas. And you started by asking, what is the concept of slow looking? And I've thought about it a lot, and I will share with you my definition. I like to sort of give it a concrete definition, and the way I define it these days is that I think that slow looking means taking time to notice more than meets the eye at first glance. And that's a short sentence, but a lot is packed in there. And there are a few things I'd like to point out about that definition. First of all, it's about looking again, taking the time to look again beyond a first glance. And I think that pivot of sort of intentionally deciding to look again is key to what slow looking means. So that's one thing I'd like to bring out. Also, the language, the phrase slow looking and the definition I've given uses the language of the visual. But of course, slow looking, which is about observation, can happen in many different ways and through many senses. So even though I'm using the language of the visual, I mean to include looking through hearing, through sound, through sight, through touch, through our emotions, through the lens of our background knowledge. So all of these are different ways of looking, and I mean the definition to embrace all of that. Also, I think an important point about slow looking is that it is multidisciplinary. That is to say that slow looking is practiced in many different disciplinary contexts, and it has different flavors in different places. So if you're in a museum and you're slow looking at art, it's sort of one sort of mood. If you're a scientist and you're in the field and you're doing careful scientific observation, it's another flavor or mood. If you're a historian and looking closely at historical artifacts, yet another. So slow looking has many practices across disciplines, but it also has some commonalities across disciplines. So that's a word about what the concept of slow looking is, but you might be thinking, well, what does it look like in practice? So I'm going to share a few images with you to sort of give you a sense of what we might be thinking about when we think about slow looking. Okay. Okay. Often when people hear the phrase slow looking, they think of something kind of like in this mood, sort of standing at a high point and looking out over a vista and just being really slow in your mood and taking everything in. And indeed, that is a form of slow looking, and it's something that is attractive and I think is accessible to us all. But it can also look many different ways, and let me give you some examples. So here here you'll see some pictures. You see some field biologists out in the field doing some work, studying carefully. They're engaged in slow looking. Below that, you see some young people sketching images of what they're observing. So they're looking closely at nature and they're making sketches. That's a form of slow looking. Below that, you see an image of some young people in a village, and they're sort of investigating their community, and they're sort of capturing, taking pictures of, and sort of writing about all kinds of things that they're seeing. That's a form of slow looking. Often when we talk about slow looking, we think about art. So here you see on the very top of this middle row, you see somebody standing in front of a work of art in a museum. And that too is a common form of slow looking. It might be what we mean. The picture right below that shows actually some medical students who are in a museum practicing some observation strategies to develop their medical observation skills. It's another way that slow looking can look. And then the bottom image there is of just some students in the classroom. I believe it's a classroom studying the history of the Renaissance, and they're looking at some Renaissance art and taking the time to look closely at it. Lastly, a little different sense. Might be a little hard to see, but the top photograph in this last row shows students. These are actually students in a museum in Washington, D.C., and they're looking with their bodies. They are taking on the shape of some images that they see in some paintings and sort of exploring observation through their bodies. Below that, you see three young people who are actually, if you're wondering what they're doing, they're taking apart a light bulb. So they're slow looking by actually physically taking something apart, which is a very powerful way of slow looking. And then at the very bottom, you can see some scientists who are out in the field, and they are listening closely because, of course, you can listen really closely as a way of observing your surround. So all of these are sort of different ways that slow looking might look if you're sort of trying to get a feel for what it looks like in practice. But let me go back to the image that I just shared with you a moment ago, this one, and say a few more words about the definition of slow looking. Sometimes people associate the concept of slow looking with the concept of mindfulness. And that makes a lot of sense because mindfulness is a calm state of mind in which we try to be really centered and at peace. And one can imagine that this young person gazing out might be in a state of mindfulness. But while there's a big overlap between slow looking and mindfulness, there are some important differences that I want to bring out. Mindfulness is a state of mind. It's calm and centered. But you can find people doing slow looking. If you recall, I mentioned that sort of the key move of slow looking is turning and pausing and looking again, sort of just re-looking at something. That can happen in a slow and calm mood, but it also can happen very fast. And I have seen young kindergartners doing slow looking in the schoolyard where they're running around, following their curiosity, trying to look at this and then look at the next thing and the next thing. Excuse me. So sometimes the pace of slow looking is calm and slow. Sometimes it's really fast and energetic. And I just make this comment because while there is a big intersect between mindfulness and slow looking, they aren't the same thing. And I get very excited when young people have opportunities to engage in slow looking experiences. And if they do it mindfully, great. But if they don't do it mindfully, that's great too. So I like to keep kind of a low bar for what it means to do slow looking. Okay, let me say a few more words. Renata, you asked, I think your question asked me, what was the concept of slow looking and how does it help to reveal complexity in the world? And that's a great question and a big question. And you could even go further back with that question and say, well, what's good about seeing complexity in the first place? And I think there are two reasons that I just want to sort of bring out. One, perhaps most obviously, is that we are educating people to live in a complex world. The world is a very complex place. And so learning to dwell in complexity in a variety of different ways is tremendously important. I mean, we could point to so many dimensions of the world that are complex, but at this moment during the pandemic is a fabulous example of complexity in action. You know, we see the systemic complexity of the pandemic and its physiological complexity, the complexity of how it's transmitted. We see social complexity, political complexity. We even see sort of personal psychological complexity in terms of people's mental states. So even something like that is obviously very complex, and there are obviously many, many issues and themes in the world that are similarly complex. And so learning to navigate complexity is an important skill. Sometimes people can object and say, well, you know, isn't it the job of education, especially when we're educating very young people, to make things simple so that people can understand the simplicity of things, and only when you get to be older and more mature or more expert can you deal with complexity? But I actually think that even very young people are not only able to deal with complexity, but can really enjoy immersing themselves in it, as long as it's not just about solving complex problems. Sometimes people think of complexity as something that needs to be solved, but complexity can be enjoyed, it can be appreciated, it can be navigated, it can be made visible. And all of these activities, I think, are worthwhile. They're intrinsically interesting, accessible to young people, and slow looking is a great tool for bringing out complexity. So that's just by way of saying it is important to uncover complexity. And now let me share a few more images. Well, actually, I'll just share one image with you, and I'll try to say a few words about how complexity, how slow looking reveals complexity. This is a photograph that was made in the United States of America in the very early part of the 20th century, 1909, by a photographer named Lewis Hine. And it's a picture of, what you can see the picture, it's a picture taken in a mill called Bibb Mill Number 1. And it's a mill in Georgia, which is a state in the southeastern United States. And so what might happen if we took a slow look at this picture? Well, the first thing that we might do is notice lots of things about it. So as I look at it, I notice, I notice what look to be machines lined up in a row. I see a belt, so I'm imagining that a belt is turning some sort of machine. I see what looks like spools of thread on the machine. I see two children, looks like two young boys. I notice one is wearing shoes. I notice another isn't wearing shoes. I see one is wearing a hat that seems rather large for him. I notice windows in the back, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of things. We could keep on going and going, and if you all watching this could join in, I think you'd notice lots more. You might call noticing this kind of complexity the complexity of parts and the interaction between parts. So one kind of complexity that slow looking very easily brings out is just sort of the physical complexity of what we're looking at. We can name lots of different parts. There's lots of different strategies to do that, and it's a powerful way that slow looking can reveal complexity. But as we continue to look, we might also notice some other things. Like as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, what's it like to be one of those children standing on that machine? So to bring me to another kind of complexity, we may also start to notice the complexity of perspective that we can see in things or bring to things. So I might wonder, what's the perspective of these children who are doing what looks like could be dangerous work? As I look at the image some more, I notice that there are no other people in this, and that the young people seem to be kind of posed. So it makes me wonder about the perspective of the photographer. Why is this a very still image? Where are the other people in the mill? Makes me wonder about the perspective of the mill owner, and so forth. So there are lots of ways that as we continue to look at things, we can bring out the different perspectives that bear on them. And then lastly, as we continue to look, we come to understand that we ourselves are instruments of observation, that we don't come to any experience of looking like as if we were a blank slate, that we are engaged in the very act of looking, and the character of our engagement shapes what we see. So for example, I worry for those children. As a parent, I think, I look at this a little bit through my lens as a parent, and, it would make me worried if my children were engaged in that kind of work. I also know a little bit about this work and know that it was made during an era in the United States where there was a lot of push to put child labor laws on the books. So I might also look at this through this sort of a perspective, sort of a political perspective, and it might sort of bring up in me some sort of political ideas that I might bring to this, and so on and so forth. Very recently, a colleague shared with me a couple of prompts in looking at images that I think very much bring out this dimension of complexity, the complexity of engagement. She said, imagine as you're looking at an image, what does your heart know? So I look at this image and I think, well, what do I know in my heart? How do I feel about this? How do my own personal feelings shape what I see? And I shared a bit of that when I talked about sort of my feelings for the young people. She also asks, what does your body know when you look at this? And when I look at this, I realize that I'm bringing a kind of a body knowledge of knowing what it's like to stand on a ledge like that. I kind of can understand how their balance is on that rim and so on. So this is just a quick example of how even by looking at just one image, we can bring out complexity, but bring out three different kinds of complexity. The complexity of how something is made, its parts, the complexity of the different perspectives that might be implicated or entailed by what we're looking at, and then the complexity that we bring as viewers and how who we are shapes what we see. That is a quick tour of how slow looking brings out complexity. I know that I'm talking with educators, so one question that you might have in mind is, well, how do you design learning experiences to really bring out slow looking? How do you design learning experiences to really provide powerful slow looking experiences? So I'll share a little list with you. That's my current favorite list of 5 basics. And I think there are some 5 very simple things that we can do to create powerful learning experiences that support slow looking. Firstly, and I think this is tremendously important, is to set expectations and timeframes. The world is a very busy, fast place, and people can easily slow down and look at something for a minute when they might have only looked for 5 seconds if they hadn't been asked to look for a little bit longer period of time. But people need to know what the expectations are. So if you're in a classroom and you want to design a slow looking experience, let people know we're going to spend 5 minutes looking quietly at something, or we're going to set the expectation of making a list of at least 10 observations and so on. So just setting expectations and timeframes is really important. Secondly, use simple observation strategies. There are lots of them, and I think we know many of them already. Make a long list of something. Notice different kinds of things. Notice different kinds of shapes, different colors, different lines. Try to look at things from different physical points of view. And there are lots of resources out there for finding observation strategies. Then a third sort of design basic is provide opportunities to let people who are looking really dwell in the act of description. So say what you see, now describe it a little bit more in more detail, describe it a little bit more, because the more you look, the more you see, and the more you say what you see, the more you see. So there's a sort of a really nice loop between elaborating in a description and then seeing more. Fourthly, and very importantly, discover how other people see things. I love experiences where people are slow looking in groups, in pairs or trios or in a small group, because when you hear what somebody else sees, you often see something new. And then lastly, this connects to the point I made earlier about complexity of engagement. Take time to reflect on your own lens. Create looking experiences that at some point invite viewers to reflect on what they themselves are bringing to the viewing experience. So, those are some design principles. And I just want to close by sort of returning to your question, Renata, about why it's so important. And I'll just sort of list quickly 3 reasons why I think slow looking is important. One is because it uncovers complexity, and I've spent a bit of time talking about that. Also, I think from an educational perspective, slow looking experiences are intrinsically engaging and rewarding. They develop curiosity, they build engagement. When you look, you are drawing information from yourself. So it creates a sort of intrinsically meaningful experience because you're building on your own knowledge that you get from your own senses and then adding to it. So I think that it's intrinsically engaging. And I also think that slow looking can help shift traditional ideas about where knowledge lives, because often young people or any learners of any age are encouraged to think that knowledge lives in other people's minds or in textbooks or other places. But actually, there's plenty of knowledge that we have within ourselves, and much of that is observational knowledge from looking at the world. So that's important. And then lastly, this is about my own values. I think that slow looking is important because it is both a value and a disposition that matters a lot in today's world. The value is that the belief that there is much to see beyond a first glance. You remember I sort of defined slow looking as looking beyond a first glance and believing that there is something to see beyond first impressions is a value. And I think it's a value that can be shared across borders. It's a disposition because I think through slow looking experience, we can build the disposition to linger in complexity. And as I mentioned, I think understanding and learning to linger in complexity is tremendously important in today's world. So that in a nutshell is answer to your question, Renata, and thank you again for the opportunity to share my ideas.
Oh my God, thank you very much. Thank you for your availability and to share with us your reflections and your research.
And good luck to you. Good luck to you and with the
pandemic. For us.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. See you. Bye-bye.